Welcome, everybody. My name is Mina Jane, and I'm the director of the Ashland Public Library in Massachusetts. I am thrilled to be here with John Leysath, who was with us a few months ago to talk about the Hammond Castle Museum. It was such a wonderful talk that we just had to have John back to tell us more. So here we are talking about more. But before I hand it over to John to tell you all about the Hammond Castle Museum and John Hays Hammond Jr., which we're focusing on today, I'd like to thank the Friends of the Ashland Public Library for supporting all of our programming. And I would like to thank John and the Hammond Castle Museum for allowing us to partner with other libraries to bring this program to you. So I will put a list of those libraries in the chat, but I do welcome everybody from those libraries or from wherever you heard about this program. We're happy to have you here. John's going to talk for about an hour. As I mentioned a minute ago, I have disabled the chat for you to chat with each other, but I will open that back up after the presentation so you can talk to each other a little bit while we have a Q&A. But questions need to go in the Q&A, which is a button at the bottom of your screen, so I don't lose track of them. So John Leysath is the curatorial director of the Hammond Castle Museum in Gloucester. He is an expert on everything this museum and John Hays Hammond Jr. He is just a delight to talk to and also super knowledgeable about not just the museum and John Hammond Jr., but the effect that John Hammond Jr. had on the world. So welcome, John. Thank you so much for being here, and I cannot wait for this conversation.
Well, thank you as well. Yeah, I appreciate being able to talk to you again, so thank you for inviting me back. So today I'm going to be speaking mainly about the life and work of our museum's founder, inventor, John Hays Hammond Jr. But I'm also going to touch upon a little bit of the unique kind of nature of this man, very unusual person. I hope that by the end of today's talk, I should say, that you'll understand why I call Hammond yesterday's man of tomorrow. So that is really the main thing that I want to kind of get across here is Hammond was well known in his time, very accomplished scientist. He was a household name, but he's not so much anymore, even locally to a certain extent. And well, we at the museum, we're trying to change that a little bit. So yesterday's man of tomorrow. There's a little propaganda poster we put together as part of a previous exhibit. So locally, Hammond Castle Museum has long been known as something of an oddity. Medieval European Gothic style castle, but built in the 1920s on the North Shore of Massachusetts. Some eccentric scientist and inventor made it his home, but it was also a museum. All that's technically true, but that's not really an accurate picture of either the origin or present reality of the museum. So to gain a better understanding of Hammond and the museum, let's start by rewinding actually back to the 19th century and the previous generation. See, John Hays Hammond Jr.'s father, who is on screen right now, was, as you might imagine, a man called John Hays Hammond Sr. Now, he was a San Franciscan native who grew up in the shadow of the 1849 gold rush and who would himself become synonymous with gold mining as he progressed into his adult career. Now, Hammond Sr. was a complex and colorful man, like his son would be as well. I'm not really here today to talk about him, but I think it's important to understand the lineage that produced Hammond Jr. His father was a fabulously wealthy man who made his money due to his expertise in mining for precious ores from North America to South Africa. He was also an active and shadowy figure, let's say, in politics on a first-name basis with several former U.S. presidents, most notably William Howard Taft, who considered him actually for his running mate back in 1908. So this then was the world into which Hammond Jr., as you see on the screen now, was born in 1888, a world of privilege, prestige, and power. He had access to opportunities that few others did, and he took full advantage of them. I say this not to diminish his accomplishments, by the way, but to put them into proper context. The story of Hammond was not a Horatio Alger-esque rags to riches tale. In other words, it's very much riches to riches, which is far more realistic, I feel. Despite this, Hammond was a legitimately brilliant mind and a visionary, honestly, who deserves to reclaim some of the reputation he once enjoyed in the public imagination, but which has faded from our collective memory as the decades have passed since his death in 1965. So, Hammond displayed a pretty early aptitude for science. One anecdote shared by his father claims that his son was presented with a fine Swiss clock as a child, and no sooner had he received the gift than he had taken it apart in an effort to discover its workings. As a teenager, he began devising clever machines and mechanisms, often involving electric components, such as a switch triggered by a door that would turn off the room's lights once opened, sort of like a reverse refrigerator light. This was to circumvent a restrictive lights out policy in his school dormitory to enable him to stay up late. Anyone who got suspicious would be met with a darkened room if they opened the door to investigate, as you see there in those comic strip panels. And just for a moment, I want to just mention those just briefly. This is an example of what I mean, how Hammond was actually a pop cultural figure who is the type of person who is prominent enough to actually have comic strip biographies printed in multiple publications about his life. For his part, Hammond Sr. encouraged his son's interest in science and technology. Around 1900, Thomas Edison himself sought the mining engineer's advice on a new method of gold extraction that he was working on. And recognizing that his son might benefit from meeting the famous inventor, he brought young Jack along to tour Edison's laboratory. And this really inspired young Hammond. And Edison himself took a liking to him. He kind of went on to act as an informal mentor to Hammond Jr. And in particular, he impressed upon the lad the importance of patenting one's ideas. Otherwise, even the child of a rich man might end up penniless as an inventor. Edison famously was nothing if not a tireless marketer of his company's inventions, even those that he himself did not actually invent. Hammond took his advice to heart and even worked in the US Patent Office briefly to familiarize himself with the process and keep an eye on emerging, potentially lucrative technological fields. Now, Edison was not the only famous mentor to Hammond. During his time studying at Yale Sheffield School of Science from 1906 to 1910, following in his father's footsteps, he met and was taken under the wing of none other than Alexander Graham Bell, who you see there with young Hammond outside one of Bell's homes in Canada. Alexander Graham Bell, the inventor of the telephone, would go on to recommend that Hammond be awarded a doctorate from George Washington University in recognition of a 4-volume thesis the young inventor had written on the subject of radiodynamics, or as we call it today, radio control. And he did, in fact, get that doctorate. Now, Hammond filed his first patent for a wireless control apparatus in 1909 during his senior year at Yale, although it was actually several more years until it was actually granted to him. The first patent he actually received was in 1912 for a naval war game apparatus, of all things, a chess-like board game of naval strategy. And fun fact, the museum actually produces a version of that game today, over 110 years after it was first designed. And I bring up this board game not only as an interesting piece of trivia, but also to illustrate a point. Even early in his 5-decade-long career, Hammond filed patents for a pretty wide spectrum of different ideas. He was really a serial inventor and received at least 551 patents in both the United States and in other countries throughout his career. He was one of this country's most prolific inventors. Still in the top 100 list, I believe, as the last time I checked. Now, shortly after graduating from Yale, Hammond began corresponding with Nikola Tesla, the famed inventor whose work was instrumental in developing alternating current, or AC power, among many other feats of technological wizardry. He was interested in collaborating with Tesla because the latter had made pioneering achievements in the field of radio control. Hammond's particular interest in this time period. He had a lot of interest, as I said, throughout his career, but early on, this is what he focused on primarily, despite aberrations, you might call them, like the board game. So in 1898, Tesla demonstrated the wireless control of a small 4-foot boat at an expo in Madison Square Garden. You see a little cartoon of that there. And Hammond wanted his help in pushing that technology even further. So correspondence between the two men throughout 1911 reveals that the older inventor, Tesla, was interested in some sort of partnership, although he had lost some interest in wireless technology by that point. He was more concerned with developing a new type of turbine engine, which needed funding to further its research. This he secured by way of the Hammonds, including Hammond Sr. and Jack's older brother, Harris Hammond, kind of the businessman of the family. Many thousands of dollars in funding was actually provided to Tesla via the Hammond family, despite Hammond Sr.'s warning to his son that Tesla tended to spend gold as if it were copper. In fact, this ended up being the sticking point between Tesla and the Hammonds. The famous scientist's work was expensive and moving too slowly for the comfort of Harris Hammond in particular, who felt that they had invested too much money in the project and were not seeing enough return on their investment, not seeing enough results quickly enough. He said as much in a response to Tesla's request for more funds after the initial grant had dried up. And unfortunately, this caused a bit of a rift between Tesla and Hammonds and the Hammond family, and the planned Tesla-Hammond Wireless Company fizzled out. However, it should be noted that even late in his life, Tesla did actually write favorably and respectfully of John Hays Hammond Jr. Incidentally, this was not the only abortive business venture that Hammond undertook with a famous peer. In the 1920s, he was in talks with Clarence Birdseye, the frozen food pioneer, whose name still graces products in the freezer sections of grocery stores nationwide, to form a company. Birdseye had moved to Gloucester and established a frozen seafood enterprise there by the time the two met. That's appropriate. After all, Gloucester is perhaps most famous today for its frozen seafood in the form of Gorton's products, just a couple minutes down the road from here. While Hammond and Birdseye did not end up forming a company together, the inventor would later go on to develop various types of thermometers for use in frozen food and vaccine packaging as indicators of potential spoilage. Like I said, his output was pretty diverse. But despite these forays into other fields of technology, Hammond remains most well known for his military contracting. Roughly half of Hammond's patents relate to the military in some way, or at least have the potential of military applications. It was his work in developing the foundational principles of efficient radio control of naval craft, including torpedoes and ships, that won him the attention of the U.S. government. Hammond had spent his post-college years perfecting his control of watercraft, aircraft, and projectiles from great distances. In succession over a 12-year period between 1911 and 1923, Hammond demonstrated radio control of relatively small yachts, such as the Pioneer, and even to larger vessels such as the Radio and the Natalia, which you see a photo of there. The Natalia in particular is well known because he steered that over long distances via shore-based transmitters. And he also even outfitted ships of war with his devices, such as the torpedo boat H-4 and even the Spanish-American war-era battleship, the USS Iowa, for military testing. So you see the Iowa right there. In 1916, Hammond testified before the House of Representatives in an attempt to sell the United States Navy his technology in order to form a system of coastal defense using his radio-guided torpedoes, known as the Fisher Island Proposal, or Proposal Z, which I always think sounds like something out of a comic book. Remember that this was right in the middle of the First World War. But before the entry of the US into the conflict, unrestricted submarine warfare was a major concern, particularly in the wake of the sinking of the Lusitania. You've probably heard of that in 1915. Hammond succeeded in convincing the House of the importance of his system, but the Senate vetoed the expenditure. It actually took another 16 years and a lot of wrangling back and forth for Hammond's patents to actually be purchased by the US government in the 1932 appropriations bill. The torpedoes would later be tested in World War II, but they had issues with their susceptibility to jamming by enemy signals. Hammond, for his part, was well aware of the issue of radio interference, either intentional or otherwise. After all, a great many of his patents relate either to the refinement of or the encryption of radio signals, but he also realized that no system stays secure forever. By the time the Navy got hold of the technology, it had vulnerabilities. Now, interestingly, these vulnerabilities were so widely known that they got the attention of an Austrian-born Hollywood actress by the name of Hedy Lamarr. Lamarr was also an amateur scientist, something she's getting a lot more credit for these days. And she found the puzzle of how to prevent wireless torpedoes from being jammed or controlled by enemies intriguing. Along with her friend George Antheil, a composer and pianist, she developed a system based on a player piano roll that could be used to cycle through 88 different radio frequencies, which corresponded to the number of keys on a standard piano, seemingly at random, but actually in a specific sequence whose code would only be known by allies. So if an enemy managed to stumble upon the correct frequency that the torpedo was being controlled by in that moment, they could only disrupt it for that moment before it switched over to another one. And we call this frequency hopping. It's really still a fundamental principle in modern wireless technology. As the torpedoes were still experimental and as Lamarr's work was unfortunately considered alien property during the war due to her Austrian heritage, she was not compensated for her work by the Navy, although it did begin using it following the expiration of her patent. Now, back to Hammond, he did a lot of military work devising everything from bombs to rockets to control systems to encryption methods. He was restless. One of his chief passions was music, especially the music of pipe organs. And you see Hammond himself climbing down a ladder there into one of his organ chambers. He constructed a massive custom 8,300 pipe organ within the walls of his castle home. Now, it's important to mention at this point that no, John Hays Hammond Jr. was not the inventor of the well-known Hammond organ. I really need to make this point clear. That was an electric organ devised by Lawrence Hammond, that fellow that you see on the screen now, also a prolific American inventor and a contemporary of Jack Hammond, whose work overlapped with his in multiple areas, interestingly enough. But there was no actual relation between the two. That didn't and still doesn't stop the two from being confused for one another. However, I can't tell you how many times I've seen people walk into the museum's Great Hall, a large central room modeled after a 13th century French Gothic cathedral, and they look at the organ console and pipes and ask if, or assume that, our Hammond invented the Hammond organ. Likewise, Lawrence Hammond is sometimes erroneously credited in online sources as the developer of radio-guided torpedoes for the US Navy. It's worth mentioning that the two were aware of this confusing coincidence. There's a letter exchange between the two where Jack Hammond comments that it seemed that he had risen to fame at the desk of Lawrence Hammond's organs, but that he hoped his torpedoes had been friendly to him as well. So Jack Hammond's electro-pneumatic pipe organ was capable of self-playing via rolls similar to player pianos. Interesting how that technology has popped up again. But was also played by many of the great organists of the age, both for concerts and for records. We're actually in the middle of a digitization project of some of those recordings, and I will tell you, I'll give you a little teaser here. We have finally found a sample of Hammond's voice on one of those recordings. We'd been searching for this for a long time. We hadn't had a sample of his voice. Now we do. So that was very exciting, especially for me personally. But yeah, so a lot of records were recorded using the organ. Hammond was an audiophile with an amazing sound system controlled by his patented dynamic multiplier. And remnants of that can still be seen today in our invention room. The panel that you see on the right-hand side of that photo, that is today in our invention room. Now, the organ hasn't been played in some time due to needing restoration, but there is a project that has been going underway for some time to enable it to be played again, so stay tuned for more on that. I want to talk some more about Hammond's inventions. Before we get to that, though, let me mention a bit about his home and museum. You might wonder why he decided to build a castle to live in and showcase his collection of ancient medieval Renaissance pieces. Well, Hammond's interest in the medieval period goes back to his childhood. Towards the end of 1896, Hammond's family, including his father, mother, and older brother, relocated to Kent, England for a few years before returning to the United States. This was after a bit of trouble Hammond Sr. had run into in South Africa that we don't really have time to get into here. So this is where his younger brother, Richard, was born, who later became a successful composer, who counted among his friends Igor Stravinsky, for example, who Jack Hammond also knew. Jack was enrolled in boarding school in Kent and became enchanted with the many English castles that he saw. Indeed, he wished his family had chosen to live in one instead of a manor house, but apparently the lack of modern plumbing was a bit of a deal breaker for his parents. Still, the boy was so taken with castles that he resolved to build one for himself someday. And his first attempt to do this came several years after his family returned to America. In 1903, the Hammonds purchased a large plot of land called Lookout Hill in West Gloucester, an area of the city often referred to as Magnolia. You can see a photo of that house that they purchased, the centerpiece of the property right there. He built a lavish summer home, maintaining other residences in places like New York, New Jersey, and Washington, D.C., but it was Gloucester that they became most established, really intertwined with the history of this city. Hammond and his young brothers lived in a residence on the compound known as the Bungalow as young men. And it was on this property that he established his first laboratory and first company, the Hammond Radio Research Laboratory, where he began his professional work alongside skilled engineers like Albert Trenner, who you see in that narrow slice there. Not a whole lot of good pictures of him, unfortunately, that we have found so far. Benjamin Messner and E.S. Purington. And due to disagreements with his family, he actually caused a little bit of a rift between himself and especially his mother by his choice to marry Irene Fenton Hammond, an older woman and divorcee. He basically was kind of kicked out of the house as a result. There's a long story behind that we don't really have time to get into, but yeah, so he ended up moving for a new property and built what became Hammond Castle Museum about 1.5 miles down the road, essentially. Now, some sources claim that the money for actually constructing this building came via the sale of many of Hammond's patents to RCA, the broadcasting and electronics giant of the age. It's true that Hammond sold a number of lucrative patents to the Radio Corporation of America in 1923, and it's also true that he remained a board member at the company for the rest of his life. You can actually, you can see him down there in that third row there, John Hays Hammond Jr. This is from a publication about the first 25 years of the company. Um, so that's unclear at this point. Recent research has suggested that substantial funding for the building of the museum came from other private individuals. So it's hard to say for sure how much RCA money went into the building. It's a research topic we're still looking into a bit more. Now, the building was always envisioned as both a home and a museum. It was to stand as Hammond's legacy, as well as a tax save. And it turns out that he could save a lot of money on property taxes by incorporating his home as a museum, which he did in 1930, and allowing the public to view his collection. There's some initial legal wrangling over the matter, but Hammond won out in the end. And as for his vision of what type of museum he would build, he wrote that he wanted to create both an architectural museum as well as a lapidarium, which is a type of museum that showcases specifically works of marble and other stone pieces, of which we have many. And since I spoke at length about the building and its collection in my previous presentation, here I don't want to really retread too much of that ground. Suffice to say that we at the museum are working to give Hammond a larger legacy than just his home. In recent years, the museum has placed a much greater emphasis on archival research. Excuse me one moment. Hammond Castle Museum's colorful history has led to an awful lot of local legends, rumors, and just plain fabrications, which make it sometimes difficult to separate fact from fiction. And to that end, we're learning or relearning much about the history of Hammond and his collection. And this has enabled us to dispel much of the mythology surrounding the museum. And I think that the truth is interesting enough to stand on its own without such embellishments, if I do say so myself. But yeah, sometimes that means we find out that a fun anecdote probably never happened, or that an artifact we thought was ancient is really modern, things like that. But sometimes, just sometimes, the reverse happens. Sometimes our research uncovers a hidden gem long forgotten, or reveals that what we thought was too good to be true actually has evidence behind it. With that in mind, let's return to the subject of Hammond's work. To preface this, I want to state that while Hammond has been considered the last of a dying breed of great singular inventors by, among others, former President Ronald Reagan, who wrote a letter to celebrate the 100th anniversary of Hammond's birth in April of 1988. The reality is he didn't work alone. He was the president of the Hammond Research Corporation and worked with a team of talented scientists and engineers, some of whom you can see right there, and some I mentioned earlier in particular. And if you look at his patents, you'll find that Hammond's name is not the only one that appears on many of them. Indeed, some of them don't even list him as an inventor at all, but merely as an assignee. And the distinction is that a number of the patents that came out of his laboratory were owned by Hammond, but actually created by employees of his. You know, this was common before Hammond's time. See Edison for a particularly egregious example, particularly regarding some of Tesla's work. And it's still the case today. For his part, Hammond was usually quick to credit others for their work, so he wasn't necessarily the glory hog that Edison is often accused of being these days. That said, each patent needs to be evaluated based on its own dimensions. So, in an oral history recorded with longtime Hammond associate E.S. Purington, the latter characterizes Hammond as a big ideas person who left a lot of the nuts and bolts to be figured out by him and other engineers. In that sense, there's a temptation to draw an imperfect parallel between Hammond and, say, like a Steve Jobs, the late co-founder of Apple, and consider someone like Purington as Steve Wozniak type of figure, the other Apple co-founder who did most of the actual engineering that went into its early computers. But to make those kind of comparisons really discredits a lot of the genuine scientific brilliance and visionary nature of Hammond. You know, Jobs though a reasonably competent engineer early in his career, was more of a designer or marketer at the end of the day, though he was himself a visionary. You've got to examine the patents that Hammond filed himself for himself, even though he was assisted in many cases by others, to get a more accurate picture of his vision and talent, to understand why he was, as I've dubbed him, yesterday's man of tomorrow. There was a reason why Hammond was well known in his time, why he was frequently interviewed in newspapers and magazines, why he was given biographical spreads in the pages of DC Comics, and why he earned monikers like the father of radio control, the wizard of patents, and the electronic sorcerer. I'll give you an example. I mentioned earlier that Hammond collaborated with an engineer by the name of Benjamin Messner. Messner had constructed the world's first robotic dog, if you like, originally called an orientation mechanism, then electric dog, and finally Salino. This box on wheels might not appear to be particularly canine in appearance, but it was a marvel of its time. Salino was developed beginning in 1910 or so and became more well known around 1912. Robotic pets have been with us for a long time, folks. But Salino would not have been Salino without Hammond. While Messner built the robot, it was Hammond who realized that selenium, hence the name, would be the way to control it. This was not a radio-controlled robot, but a light-controlled one. By shining a light towards Salino's eye-like lenses, a circuit would be completed, allowing the device to move towards or away from, via a switch, the light source. Selenium here was acting as what we call a photoresistor. Now, resistor, as the name implies, resist electrical current. And photoresistors specifically lose resistance in the presence of light, specifically allowing the current to pass through. So if it's dark, resistor says, nope, not getting through. And if it's light, okay, you can pass. Now, it sounds like Hammond's idea was pretty nuts and bolts to me. Incidentally, if you're wondering why Hammond and Messner created Salino, they were experimenting with light-guided torpedoes that could home in on an enemy vessel's searchlights. That use proved impractical, however, so they toyed with the idea of making Salino a robotic guard dog instead. And I'm not making this up, equipping him with a revolver who would be attracted to, say, the flashlight of a would-be burglar. I want to stress that this was never actually put into practice. Now, novelties aside, the primary Hammond invention I want to talk to you about is it's a pretty big deal in my view. And to appreciate why, I want to give you some background information as to how I found out about it. All right, so while planning for the 2023 season, one of my main projects was to overhaul our invention room, which is an exhibit space converted from one of Hammond's guest rooms that we used to showcase his career. Now, my predecessor as curator had assembled an impressive 7-foot-tall list of Hammond's U.S. patents to hang on the wall, but in addition to needing a graphical update to fit with our current branding, I decided that we should not only remake the list, but add one for his foreign patents as well. And you can see on the left-hand picture what the current setup looks like. Now, for reference, as of the current count, Hammond held 437 patents in the United States and 114 altogether across 7 other countries. That's a lot of material to parse, and I wanted to make sure we had the most accurate, up-to-date count we possibly could. As the reported number has varied depending on the source over the years, the former curator, to his credit, was very diligent, and he concluded that Hammond held 437 patents, which is true, except the list he made was missing 2 of them. So after combing through every patent register to Hammond that I could find in the electronic databases, I had sources for each entry on that list, but I still couldn't find more than 435 US patents. And at that point, I chalked up the discrepancy as being the result of a simple miscount on my predecessor's part and concluded that Hammond had indeed received only 435 patents in the US. Big whoop, huh? But it still bothered me. Now, as it happens, Hammond's laboratory had volumes of the company's patents printed up and collected into several bound volumes, which we still have in our collection. Here you can see a photo of Hammond himself studying one of them. Well, One of those volumes was an index, which listed every patent assigned to Hammond up until that point, which frankly was the majority of his career, as he slowed down considerably by the 1950s and 1960s. Every registered patent has a number, and this dusty old volume contained those numbers along with descriptions of the patents. And I need to explain a kind of a peculiarity of patent law in the United States here. Generally speaking, once a patent application has been filed, approved, granted, that patent becomes public information. Now, it doesn't enter the public domain until 20 years have elapsed to previously 17, but it's a government document that can be freely accessed. Indeed, it's very important that this is the case, as anyone who wants to file a patent needs to research to make sure it hasn't already been filed by somebody else. And that's also why it can take many years for certain patents to be granted. However, there's a notable exception to this policy. Patents which the United States determines to be vital to national security may not be published for public view. Now, they can still be purchased, royalties paid to the inventor, etc., but everything that happens when a patent is publicly registered, in other words, but the actual document is withheld, kept secret, and therefore unregistered. So as much of Hammond's work was related to national security, we wondered if that might account for the discrepancies in the various counts that have been published over the years. Frequently, for example, you'll see Hammond credited with having over 800 patents. But since I can only come up with about 550 or so, did that mean he had 250 plus secret patents? I got to tell you, there was no reference to any secret patents in the index, nor have any secret documents ever been found to date in our archives, to my knowledge. We honestly don't know if any actually exist. My point is that we were trying to be exhaustive, making sure to do our due diligence to come up with every possible patent publicly credited to Hammond. And that meant cross-checking every patent listed in that old index with all the others we'd assembled up to that point. And it's through that process that I made an interesting discovery, or rediscovery, if you like. I found that there were indeed 2 missing patents from the previous list we displayed in the museum. And the way I discovered them was by using the patent numbers to look them up. You see, when you do patent research, you can search by any number of criteria. The inventor's name alone will often get you pretty far, provided it's uncommon enough, but not all the way. And through my own research, I realized that, Hammond's name in particular is a bit, shall we say, tricky. First, there's the fact that the Hammond family was not exactly the most creative bunch when it came to baby names, with multiple Johns, Harrises, Natalies, Richards, etc. And this leads to confusion over which Hammond is which. It's not uncommon for misspellings to occur either. For example, John J. Hammond Jr. appears in some sources when referring to Hammond alongside spellings of Hays with an extraneous letter E, things like that. And you couple that, that with simple typos and imperfections in optical character recognition software that's used to digitize these old typed documents. And sometimes you can't rely on the name alone to pull up everything, but the numbers are usually more reliable. So every patent has one, and if you know it, you can usually pull the patent right up. And that's essentially all I did. I entered every single patent number I found in the book one by one, and was able to account for all but 2. And those 2 did not come up in previous searches for a simple reason. There was no name in the inventor information field in electronic databases. That's it. It was blank. For whatever reason, while Hammond's name appeared on the scanned documents themselves, that information didn't populate into the appropriate part of the database, so only by pulling them up by their numbers did they appear. Now, one of them, if you'll forgive me for saying so, it's probably not all that interesting. If you're really curious, you see a page from it right there on the screen. It's patent number 1,607,158, titled System for the Transmission and Reception of Radiant Energy, which is really a fancy way of saying a radio transmitter and receiver system. And the same title appears on another patent filed on the same day that we did know about previously. A number of Hammond patents have identical names, but cover different aspects of the same underlying technology. But it's the second lost patent, if you like, I found that was actually significant. US patent number 1,725,710. Don't worry, there will not be a test. System and method of television. Now, when I first saw this, it immediately stood out to me simply because it was filed on August 15th, 1923. Previously, it was thought that Hammond's first television-related patents were filed in 1929. So that would have been interesting enough, the fact that he'd actually begun work in the medium 6 years earlier. But once I actually read through the patent, it became clear that this was more than just a footnote in Hammond history. See, many of Hammond's patents were improvements to existing systems or components of larger ones. But this patent, however, was for a unique and complete system of television, including not only the device itself, but the means by which content could be broadcasted. So every aspect of a television system described in this patent, complete with variations. And in order to understand its significance, however, I need to first delve into a bit about the history of TV. Now, I'm working on a whole big exhibit about this to open next season, so that'll go into a lot more depth, but I'll give you an overview. So while the concept of television was theorized as early as 1837 with the advent of the telegraph, and the first experimental attempts were made at transmitting still images in the 1840s, it really wasn't until 1884 that Paul Nipkow of Germany patented something called a Nipkow disc, which was a rotating disc that television really became practical. So this was part of a system known as mechanical television. This was the first form of TV. Mechanical televisions used moving parts to display images, essentially a light cast on a subject, like the light hitting me right now, would be filtered through a spiral of tiny little holes on this disc. And that disc would be spun at very high speeds. And then that light would pass through those holes and then interact with an electrically conductive surface coated with a light-sensitive substance, which would allow these very subtle variations of light and shadow that make up all images, even those ones that come directly into our eyes. We need that light to define what we see. Those variations of light and shadow to be converted into electrical signals. And those signals could then be transmitted and received by another similar device, kind of running in reverse, synchronized with the original, to reconstruct that original image. So the spinning holes, when spun very rapidly, formed lines, or the illusion of lines. And we call these scan lines. And these represented small slivers of the total image. Because of the high speed, persistence of vision would interpret these flickery images as a coherent moving picture. But all electronic televisions were the future. Not mechanical, moving, spinning disc televisions, but televisions that were entirely electronically operated. The old tube televisions, cathode ray tubes, CRTs, whatever you want to call them, the ones that we used before the era of the flat screen, that was really going to be the future at that point. Between 1902 and 1909, Boris Rosing, a Russian inventor, developed an electromechanical television system, and in doing so, he first made use of a selenium photoresistor, much like our electric dog Soleno from earlier, as the light-sensitive cell that could translate the subject into electrical impulses. Rosing's system was very primitive. All it could really do was silhouettes, but it can be considered the first proper CRT television display. Around the same time, A. Campbell Swinton, a Scottish engineer, developed theories about what it would take for a fully electronic CRT-based television system. So how do CRTs work? Well, basically, they receive the electrical impulses of the broadcast and a heated filament in a tube or cathode, sort of like a light bulb filament. It heats up and it excites electrons in this vacuum, special vacuum tube that is known as a cathode ray tube. And then those electrons are refined and shot out of an electron gun, as we call it. So a refined beam of electrons that communicates all these electrical impulses that represent all the small pieces of the image to be transmitted. They would hit a phosphor-coated screen on the inside of this glass cathode ray tube. So the reverse side, so you look at the old tube television, you're looking at the screen, now the reverse side has a phosphor, special chemical coating that lights up in response to these electrons hitting it in varying degrees of intensity. And what a CRT television does, the electron gun draws images line by line by line, horizontal lines, vertically stacked. In the old days of television, it was 480 lines that make up the actual picture, 525 lines that were totally broadcast. And those are just little slices stacked on top of each other of this complete image, reconstructed. But because it's all electronic and electrons, it's moving at the speed of light. It's moving super, super fast. So you're getting 30 whole pictures a second. And that allows you to translate that as motion. Now, beginning in 1913, Charles Francis Jenkins, an American inventor whose output rivaled Hammond's, worked on television transmission, but did not demonstrate it in a documented witness form until a few months after Hammond had filed his first television patent. But Hammond did actually see his demonstration firsthand, which we'll get to a little bit later. It should be noted that Jenkins' system was a mechanical television. You see Jenkins there, you can see the disc that forms the basis, and you can see a little light bulb, light source that would illuminate the picture behind that. Now, in the early 1920s, an eccentric Scottish inventor by the name of John Logie Baird was also conducting experiments in television, the most successful in a long line of diverse entrepreneurial efforts. His version was mechanical and produced black and white images, and you can see the first image there on the right side of the screen. Baird's first TV patent was filed in 1925, 2 years after Hammond's patent. By 1928, he had moved on to color TV, and by 1940, monochrome stereoscopic 3D television. And as a result of these inventions, Baird is often credited with inventing both color and 3D television. But as we'll soon discuss, despite his genuinely impressive results, perhaps that credit ought to be shared to some extent. Of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't also mention Philo Farnsworth, whose fully electronic television would become the standard for decades to come. He claimed to have conceptualized it as a teenager in 1920, but he didn't actually patent it until 1927. And Farnsworth's patents were so valuable that even RCA eventually had to pay him royalties, something that was actually really reluctant to do as a rule, to use them in their own products. But it's worth noting that Farnsworth Company cited Hammond's 1923 patent as prior art for 3 separate patents in the 1940s, and we'll touch on that later as well. I'd also be remiss if I didn't mention Vladimir Zworykin, another Russian inventor who actually studied under Rosing, who developed electronic color television beginning the same year as Hammond's patent, albeit after it was filed. He later went to work with RCA in 1929, on which board of directors Hammond sat, let's recall, and which gave the world the first consumer all-electronic color television set in 1954. Zworykin's work was as important as Farnsworth's, and his iconoscope television camera and corresponding kinescope television screen became the foundation for virtually all television systems for decades to come. And now let's come back to John Hays Hammond Jr. The inventor's 1923 patent describes not only CRT-based television, but color television. And if that weren't enough, it also describes stereoscopic 3D television, also in color and without the need of special glasses. It could even be used as a sort of electric telescope, early name for TV, making distant objects in dark conditions visible on a TV screen. Hammond describes a number of possible configurations for the system. He created a modified form of Nipkow disc using focusing lenses, similar to what Baird would actually later employ in a mechanical arrangement. He and his assistant Albert D. Trenner, who I briefly mentioned earlier, also conceived of a variation that would use a series of vibrating mirrors and prisms to achieve the effect. And this is the scanning effect. This is how the camera effect, if you like, how it actually takes the original image that you want to broadcast and converts it to a form where it can be sent and received later on. It's a lot of different scanning methods that were devised over the years. And finally, Hammond also envisioned a spiralized electron beam drawing images on a cathode ray tube. So like I said, cathode ray tube, you would draw horizontal lines vertically stacked to create that square image. But Hammond system, spiral, more of a curved, circular kind of design to display an image, but still using a cathode ray tube. So he was kind of combining the Nipkow disc, the spinning Nipkow disc, and that sort of concept into an electronic form. So for color, he described using various color mixing filters after an idea by Trenner, and for 3D, two separate offset overlapping images would be combined. 3D viewers for still images, photographs had existed since the 19th century, so it was kind of an evolution of that idea. And provided the viewer viewed the screen at the proper angle, there was no need for glasses. Baird's first 3D system did require glasses. He described means of transmission and reception using both wired and wireless as specialty technology. All right, so this is just a, keep things organized, a timeline of early television there. This is very simplified. Let me be really clear. I don't claim that John Hays Hammond Jr. should be credited with the invention of television as we know it. No single individual invented TV. And there are other inventors whose work was more practical and influential on its overall development. And I certainly don't claim that Hammond should be given the moniker the father of television in the way that he has been for his work in radio control. But what I do claim is simply that Hammond's name should be in the conversation when we talk and write about the history of early television, on par with people like Baird, Zworykin, and Farnsworth. And frankly, he only rarely appears in the television histories that I've read. And I've read several in preparation for this exhibit that I'm working on. You know, when I first started talking about my rediscovery of this lost patent, the question I often received was, did Hammond ever have a working prototype of his system? And, you know, to that I must confess, I don't know, but probably not. You know, by the time Hammond began his career, producing a working physical prototype wasn't a requirement for successfully registering a patent with the US Patent Office. As long as you described a system that somebody else could replicate if they had sufficient skill to do so, that was enough. If there was a prototype, it's been lost to time, much like really nearly the entire contents of his laboratory. You know, there's some scant documentation that he had some hands-on experimental experience with television in 1923, and it's known that his laboratory worked on the physical implementation of other television-related patents he had in the later part of the decade. What I can say for certain is this. Earlier, I mentioned that Hammond was profiled in pages of a DC comic book of all things, specifically in issue number 18 of Real Fat Comics in 1949. This was a short-lived series of educational anthology comics put out by DC, and they had short biographies as part of that. In Hammond's segment, you have a pretty breezy overview of his unusual life and career. And one panel that you can see there in the middle, on the bottom left of the middle image there, you see this credit Hammond with the development of a prototype version of color television. You can see it closer there. Now, while I was well aware of this comic since early my tenure in the museum, I actually personally donated a copy of it to our collection. Based on a few inaccuracies and exaggerations within the so-called real fact story, I kind of disregarded this panel for a while. Thought it was kind of spurious. The only other backing I could come up with for it was an article written about Hammond by a man named Mort Weisinger, who actually was probably the same person who wrote this comic story. But it seems I was too hasty. As I said before, sometimes that which you think is too good to be true turns out later to actually be true after all. And I can say that despite the fact that he may not have had a prototype, like I said, you don't actually need a prototype to be given credit for an invention. A patent is more than sufficient enough. Even somebody like A.A. Campbell Swinton, who didn't file patent for television system at all, is frequently mentioned in television histories for his theoretical speeches, writings, and early experiments with CRT-based TV. So why not Hammond? Now, on May 28th, 1923, nearly 3 months before it was filed, Hammond discussed his patent with Ernst Alexanderson, a Swedish-American engineer who worked for both GE and RCA, which had spun off from GE. You know, by this point, Hammond had already been elected to RCA's board of directors. Alexanderson was a really established scientist, a radio and mechanical television pioneer himself, and Hammond wrote that he talked with him, and while we don't know the extent of their conversation, he did say he outlined to him the scheme of his patent application, referring specifically to that television system patent. I can tell you that correspondence exists between Hammond and Charles Francis Jenkins in the same year. Talk of collaboration even between the two prolific inventors, as well as with RCA in general by Alexanderson, who wished to see Jenkins working under Hammond specifically. Hammond had seen Jenkins' work himself. Recall that they were both working on television basically simultaneously, and wrote about it to David Sarnoff, who's on the far right there, who would become, in a few years, the legendary head of RCA. But both Hammond and Alexanderson agreed that while Jenkins' system was novel, his work was not essential to RCA's development of television. And furthermore, Hammond correctly doubted that Jenkins would want to give up his independence to work for RCA. Jenkins later established his own rival television company, on which board of directors Hammond's own brother Harris sat, oddly enough. In fact, we only recently learned. Intriguingly, Hammond notes that Jenkins spoke to him about the possibility of color transmission on December 29th, 1923, to which he responded that he had already applied for a patent, which demonstrated the possibility of this, which he had. Now, that patent wasn't actually granted until August 20th, 1929, and perhaps this accounts for why Hammond isn't given the credit he deserves for his role as an early television pioneer. But I think the date of filing is more significant since it establishes the genesis of the idea itself, and we know from Trenner's diaries that Hammond first discussed his idea in January of 1923. But by the time we get to 1929, electronic television is the future. Some people, some diehards, are clinging to mechanical television, but it's probably not going to be the wave of the future, people realize. Maybe you could say the hard time finding this documentation in the modern digital age, when ironically it should be easier to find these things, accounts for why he's not sometimes given mention, but plenty of patents cite his. I'm just going to quickly go through some of these here. Farnsworth Research Corporation patents for three separate patents: television image tube, color television system, and a television scanning system. All of those cite Hammond's patent. One from Time Incorporated for a photo printing device cites it. From Fairchild Semiconductors for an enlarging and reducing photoelectric engraving machine, they cite it. E. Garfield Copying and Reproducing Device cites it. Raytheon cites it for a beam scanning device. Texas Instruments for a torsional vibrator light beam scanner. MIT cites it as well. And a man named, I believe his name was Antonio Medina, also cited it as early as late, I should say, as the 1980s for a 3D image display system. All right, so why am I mentioning all this stuff? Well, that's really illustrates a larger point here. We stand on the shoulders of giants when it comes to developing technology. Rarely does an invention arise from nothing. There are almost always technological antecedents, and some turn out to be nothing, but much like, evolutionary dead ends. And you could argue that Hammond's system is one of these. And indeed, to carry these biological metaphors further, that some patents are clearly examples of convergent evolution, similar solutions to a certain problem that arise independently of one another. Hammond and Jenkins were certainly well aware of each other's work, but was Baird aware of Hammond? Probably not. I've seen no evidence that he was, at least at first, maybe not until the 1930s that he was aware of him. He probably didn't know about this patent that was working its way through the US Patent Office when he was in Scotland working on his. So my aim in bringing Hammond's name back to the popular narrative, the development of television, is not to discredit the accomplishments of men like Baird, Farnsworth, Zworykin, Alexanderson, Jenkins, Rosing, or any of the other myriad of scientists and engineers who helped make this transformative technology a reality. This isn't a contest of who is more important. My argument is that they're all important, including Hammond. And there's no clearer picture, pun intended, of this than in the pages of 1932. 1932 is The Outlook for Television by Orrin E. Dunlap Jr., then radio editor of the New York Times. John Hays Hammond Jr. was asked to write the introduction to the book, which aimed to catalog the development of the technology and celebrate its potential. And as Hammond writes, I often feel that it is dangerous to prophesy too definitely on the technical future of a science. The obvious seldom happens, and so often collateral developments take place around an industry which are outgrowths of it, and which at times grow into greater magnitude than the parent industry itself. The coordination of human knowledge, the constant overlapping of problems in diversified industries, and the closer engineering contacts now established between scientists and engineers in different fields will produce new sciences in ever-increasing numbers. Inventing is getting to be easier. It is possible to move ahead more swiftly now, for many of the snags have been removed by the technical experience of others. There is also the growing sympathetic help in one science toward another. Many of the aims are achieved daily and unconsciously by those who are cooperating in the cause of science and the fight for the truth. So those were Hammond's own words. But what about Dunlap, the author of the book? Well, as he put it, prominent among the contemporaries who had devoted their time and energies to television are Dr. Ernst Frederick Werner Alexanderson, Dr. Herbert E. Ives, John Logie Baird, Vladimir Zworykin, John Hays Hammond Jr., Dr. August Carolus, Philo T. Farnsworth, Ulysses A. Sanabria, R.D. Kell, development engineer who assisted Alexanderson and Zworykin, C. Francis Jenkins, and a host of workers who have faithfully toiled with these men to rush the perfection of instruments that enable their fellow men to see by radio. Of course, in addition to Hammond, you'll by now recognize some of those other names, but there are still more listed in that quote who I didn't mention, and that's not an effort to exclude them, because I only have a limited time to speak here to you today. And you could argue that Hammond's name is also often omitted from contemporary histories of television for the sake of brevity, but I would argue that his work in television was significant enough that he should not be considered a mere footnote in the history of the medium. After all, it wasn't just the 1923 patent that constituted Hammond's contribution to television. He registered many more, including multiple for a television-based guidance system for airplane pilots that was an antecedent of GPS, a system for scrambling TV broadcasts for unauthorized viewers, and the telespot system, an ancestor of the fax machine, that enabled video and still images to be broadcast on the same signal and the images stored and printed afterwards. For all the stories about Hammond's colorful personality and the occasional accusations of self-aggrandizement a la Edison, the inventor was surprisingly humble when speaking of his career. In fact, as early as 1924, 100 years ago, he sent a letter to his father wherein he stated the following: "In a few years after I am gone, all my scientific creations will be old-fashioned and forgotten. In these days, even careers are soon forgotten. Only that which meets the eye remains. A few students dig us up, the world goes on. Where will our name be in 100 years?" For that reason, Hammond established his museum. As he put it, something in hard stone to engrave upon it for posterity, a name of which I am justly proud. But as much as Hammond predicted that he would fade into obscurity, I believe, like that of Nikola Tesla, Hammond's scientific legacy need not be forgotten, at least not forever. And I'd like to close by saying that this lecture, as I mentioned earlier, is only a preview of an exhibit we're working on to open our 2024 season in April, Hammond in the History of Television. And that goes into much greater depth about not only Hammond's contribution to the field, but the history of TV in general, as well as how the various television systems from the 19th century to the present day work on a technical level. For example, as part of the exhibit, we'll be featuring a fully functional model of a mechanical television set, built using modern digital components and 3D printed parts, which I'm very excited about. So I invite y'all to join us at Hammond Castle Museum for that, as well as to see the other new exhibits, tours, and events we've got planned for the season. Thank you very much.
Wow, that was a lot of information. Yeah, well, yeah, enjoy your drink for a second. I just want to let people know that I have opened up the chat for you to chat with each other. But if you have questions, put them in the Q&A, which is the button at the bottom of your screen. We're going to talk for maybe about another 10 minutes to take questions. And we do have a few already. So did Edison pursue a partnership with Hammond?
Not a formal partnership. As I said, he was more of an informal mentor. He would give him advice now and again. He was also friendly with Hammond's father. Believe, if memory serves, he wrote a letter to his father at one point saying, like, "Oh, I hear your son's going into inventing. Well, if he makes sure to make money from it, then he'll probably do pretty well. But But that's kind of reinforces the point of Edison's, like, you got to patent your stuff, you've got to protect yourself, you've got to do it that way, you've got to follow the commercial trends, otherwise you're just going to end up, penniless.
Right. And certainly, um, having the Castle Museum is really helpful in keeping his legacy alive. But do you think because he was around at the same time of Edison, he got overshadowed by Edison's inventions, and
Well,
that's why he's not as remembered?
well, not directly. I think Edison was of a previous generation, so they weren't really in the same class, as it were. He was frequently mentioned, and still is sometimes mentioned, as a student of Edison or a pupil or a protege. I think that's, you can draw a stronger connection between him and Alexander Graham Bell. So
Mhm.
I don't think it's that Edison specifically overshadowed him. I think it's just that Edison's inventions, at least the most successful ones, became so much a part of people's everyday lives in the home
Mhm.
that that's why they remember them, because we all use light bulbs, even though there were multiple types of light bulbs and other inventors who worked on the technology. But phonographs, I mean, the phonograph was a huge invention. I mean, that's how we listen to sound, that's how we listen to music for decades. We still do today with the vinyl revival. So I think, and Alexander Graham Bell, same thing, because the telephone, we
Mhm.
all carry them in our pockets. But radio control, well, Hammond didn't even technically invent radio control. He just, you know, I hesitate the word to use perfected it, but established the foundational principles that would go into radio control as we know it. But unless you're really into RC cars and drones and things like that, you probably don't interact with that on a daily basis, and you probably don't think of Hammond when you do. So, the other thing is, people like Tesla. Tesla was, everybody knows Tesla today, at least they know it from the car company, if nothing else. But he was forgotten for decades, pretty much, until there was an effort to revive him. It took an actual effort by first his family, which Hammond does not have anymore. He has no descendants. And then later on by other individuals to kind of prop him back up. So that's kind of what we're doing at the museum. We're trying to bring him back into people's consciousness.
Mhm. I have a comment about that. I probably won't remember later, but I do want to get to audience questions first. Allison asked, did Hedy Lamarr base some of her inventions with radio frequency or on radio frequency?
Oh, well, her patent was basically, um, it dealt with frequency hopping, is what we call it. Now, the concept of frequency hopping, she didn't actually invent it. Even Tesla talked about frequency hopping, decades before. But it's not about, we tend in the when we talk about the history of inventing whatever the invention happens to be, people get obsessed about firsts, where somebody the first to do this, the first to do that, and then the answer is usually pretty complicated. And there's so many instances of simultaneous inventions, two complete, convergent evolution, independently, not even aware of each other, around the same time, even sometimes the same day. Telephone, famously, Alicia Gray and Alexander Graham Bell were both trying to file patents, and Bell scooped in under the wire. No pun intended. And so, so first, it's not really, it's about being part of the progression and being significant and influential. And I would say Lamar's work was very influential when it dealt with
Mhm.
that technology. And she's given a lot more credit. She was given no credit in her time because she was an Austrian Hollywood actress, and it was World War II and everything. But now she is. I don't know. I've still not to this day found any link of communication between her and Hammond. I've looked, I've tried. All I know is that it was because of Hammond's inventions that were sold to the US government that she worked on. So I figure she had to be aware of him to some degree. I don't know if he was aware of her, though.
Hmm. Oh, interesting. Somebody asked, what happened to the older wife Hammond married?
Oh, Irene Fenton Hammond. Well, he did marry her, and they stayed married until her death in 1959. She was about 7 or 8 years older than him, not in great health. She had a number of health problems throughout her life, so she did predecease him. But but yeah, they stayed married, and they're by all accounts genuine affection between the two, and that sort of thing. There's a lot of differing accounts about how they met, and did he steal her away because she was divorced from this guy Reynolds, but was it because Hammond had an affair with her or stole her away, or did they get divorced and then she got with Hammond later on? You'll see different types of recounting of how that happened, but yeah.
Interesting, like the Gilded Age. Um,
Mhm.
did Hammond leave an endowment to help fund the museum?
Yeah, to some extent, but his estate, he left initially the museum in the care of Cardinal Richard Cushing,
Mhm.
Cardinal Cushing um, of Boston Catholic Church fame, pretty well known figure actually, even nationally. Um, so originally it was given to the Catholic Church. A few reasons for that: tax write-off, number one. His father had done the same thing. They weren't Catholic, but they left it to the church. Also, he had a pretty large collection of medieval religious artifacts, and I think he suspected maybe they'd have more of an interest in maintaining that. There was, again, it's one of those things where different sources vary about how much was left. I've seen roughly $1 million was left, but by this point, I mean, it's not, there's no Hammond fund that we draw upon for support these days. Any money that Hammond had that went to this place evaporated, several decades ago. Um, so we're really reliant on public support, ticket sales, events, grants for our funding.
Mhm. Okay. Lots of people last time and even this time made comments about going to those concerts with the organ. Do you know if they'll ever be bringing them back? Both Patty and Mary Ann said that they have really good memories. Well, anyways, yeah.
I can tell you this much. There is an organ restoration project going on. The goal is to have the organ be playable again. Now, as for when and under what form that's going to be, I can't tell you right now. But there is, from high up in museum leadership, the goal is to have this organ played again. So we hope so. But
Yeah.
stay tuned for more on that.
We will, because that is the one question that comes up. It has come up both times. Mary Ann then says, what do you think he would have said about today's technology?
I mean, it's hard to say, but Hammond was firmly entrenched in the analog age.
Mhm.
Um, he died just as the digital age was really starting to dawn in a significant way. Hammond did most of his work in an era of vacuum tubes instead of transistors and microchips. It's There are related concepts between analog and digital information. They're different ways of storing and communicating, transmitting and receiving and decoding information. So I think he would have understood it on that level, and I think he would have been interested in it. But I think he would have had to really, I think he would have needed a lot more time in his life to get familiar with it. Because I think of a man like Vladimir Zworykin, who I mentioned in the course of my lecture. Um, and Zworykin was still working into the 1970s, but basically had retired from RCA, but he still kept an office there, and he would check in on projects, and he would offer to help the engineers, but he didn't have a set. He was a pioneer, but by the 70s, you're talking things are very much going digital, and it's a whole different concept you have to wrap your mind around. So I think he would have had to go back in school and familiarize himself with a whole new class of things. But I'm sure he would have been fascinated, of course, by all the different applications. For example, I'll give you one clear-cut example. Um, Even though this is not necessarily a current technology, it's a more modern technology than Hammond. Hammond conceived, and this is another thing I've found through the course of my research for this exhibit, Hammond conceived, maybe for the first time, I don't want to state that too strongly, of the concept of magnetic videotape. Um, Back in 1928, he had an idea of recording television broadcasts to tape so that they could be later screened using time shifting. And that was a bleeding edge concept for 1928. In fact, most sources, and he came up with the idea in 1927, he just patented it in 1928. And most sources say that audio magnetic recording tape didn't even really exist until 1928 from a German inventor.
Mhm.
So there's stuff like that where you read this and you see, and it's laid out. I mean, it's recorded in the diary of Albert Trenner about Mr. Hammond talked about this idea, and I'm like, my God, he's talking about recording to videotape before videotape is even in existence. It doesn't even really become a thing until the 50s.
Mhm.
So it's stuff like that. So I think he would be very fascinated with all of these developments that happened past his death. But we only get so many years on this planet. We can't see everything. So,
Well, he definitely sounds like a man before his time. Somebody who could see almost science fiction-y type, like seeing into the future.
oh, sure. And he would write some science fiction occasionally
Really?
privately. Yeah.
Hmm.
My favorite
Anything
is one called the Termite Monster is my favorite.
Is it in the Castle Museum gift shop?
No, but we've done exhibits and made merchandise based on it before, and it actually, you know what? If you go to our YouTube channel, look for Hammond Castle on YouTube, the Hammond Castle account. If you search through those videos, you can see an animated, like silent movie style version of that story that I put together a while back. So if
Oh
you're
my
interested.
gosh, I'm totally going to check into that. Couple more questions. Did any
Mhm.
of his relatives invent or receive patents?
Yes, actually. Um, his sister, Natalie Hayes Hammond, she had a patent for a clamshell style watch,
Hmm.
very literal clamshell style watch, like it was shaped like that. So there's a patent that she filed for that. She didn't file any other patents that I'm aware of. She did invent a type of applique that was a trade secret, which is a different type of thing. Harris Hammond, we have learned recently, likely filed his own patent for a certain type of mining process. That's something we like literally learned the other week. It had never come up before, and it came up as a result of an unrelated thing. So yes, those we're aware of. I have never found anything registered to his father, although there were some claims that he had some sort of mining related patents, but yeah, I haven't seen any evidence of that.
Can you just really briefly tell us how complicated the patent procedure was back then? To get a patent, was it very difficult?
Well, yes and no. I mean, if you had an idea and you had a lawyer and you had some funds to start that process out, um, as long as that could be described and sketched out, and really all the requirement was like up until 1880, you had to make a model of your device. It didn't necessarily even have to be a working model, but the patent office required a model. And after that, though, there was a warehouse fire where a lot of these models were destroyed.
Mm.
And so the patent office dropped that requirement to even have any kind of model of it. And all you had to really do is you had to provide very detailed technical sketches and write up a very detailed technical explanation of what your idea is. You don't actually have to have a working prototype or anything of the sort. But it has to be written in such a way that somebody else could follow what you did and recreate it. The problem is these things could take a long time because of all the research involved to make sure it doesn't conflict with anything existing. So there was a lot of back and forth, and you see this in the records and the diaries of Hammond and his fellow scientists about how they had to review cases. There were challenges, there were claims. It could take years, sometimes decades, even to sort out these details before something could finally be granted. And once it's granted, then you have your 20-year period where you get to claim royalties on it before it's public domain. But so in that sense, it was tricky, but the process is well known to this day. I mean, there's a manual, there's all these steps you got to follow. But it was difficult for people without means to pursue it because of the various legal aspects of it, and that sort of thing.
Mhm. Um, wasn't Barbara asked, wasn't there another color TV system sponsored by CBS?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, there was. In the 1940s, CBS had a color TV system that used spinning color wheels to achieve its effects. And John Logie Baird, as I said, had a color system. Zworykin wrote about his own idea for a color system. So there's a lot of experimentation that went on surprisingly early with some of this stuff. Multiple people did come forward with their own examples. Hammond used color wheels, but not exactly the same that we would think of today. Like he didn't use red, green, and blue, which is what we would use today. But he used other forms of color mixing based on primary colors. There's different ways you can kind of go about it.
So final question, which I think I'm interested in as well, is how was Hammond in his final years? Was he still really active and, with it, or was he kind of declining?
I've seen no evidence of any kind of senility or anything like that. He actually died in New York, and he was in New York because he regularly attended RCA meetings. So up till his death, he was still involved with that company. His wife, as I said, had died a few years before him, but he still had an active, maybe not as active, but still had an active social life. So yeah, I mean, he was still working, but the last registered patent to him was actually was granted posthumously in 1967. It was granted, but it was filed, if memory serves, in 1961. So you could say that in his last few years of his life, he wasn't as active career-wise, but he was still there.
Well, that's good to know. Well, this has been amazing. As I can tell from the chat, people are really enjoying it and just think you're incredibly thorough. And we talked about this earlier, just making the information very accessible so we can understand it. I do hope that people get to this, the Hammond Castle Museum sometime in the spring and just get to enjoy it. And definitely check in and say hello to John if you see him. Not John Hammond Jr. because he's no longer, but John.
Well, you could say hi to him too. He's buried on the property, so
Oh, okay.
so if you feel free, he's in the cat garden. He loved cats, so they used to roam around in this area outside, and he's there.
Okay.
So
So you just
say
added
hi and give him a thank you for television.
there's a little bit of a creep factor there. I am out.
Well,
But
Hammond was like that too. He wouldn't be offended.
that's so funny. Well, yes, say hello to John and John, whoever, and hopefully we'll get that organ working again. And
Yeah.
definitely support that museum because it is a very special one. And I thank you, John, for being here and for sharing your time and your expertise with us. And I thank everybody for being here with us and asking all these amazing questions.
Yes, thank you.
Yep. All right, everybody, have a wonderful afternoon.